History is a tapestry woven from threads of fact, decisions made, battles fought, and technologies forged. But what of the threads that were never pulled? The whispers and rumors that haunt the periphery of our accepted past? In the desperate twilight years of the Third Reich, as Allied forces closed in from all sides, the Nazi propaganda machine churned out visions of Wunderwaffen or wonder weapons. These were revolutionary technologies, it was claimed, that would snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Jet fighters, long-range rockets, and colossal tanks filled the fevered dreams of a failing regime. Most of these projects were too little, too late, fantastic concepts that never left the drawing board or prototypes that saw no meaningful combat. Yet among the myths and the propaganda, one legend persists, a story too audacious, too terrifying to be easily dismissed: the Projekt, a broad-gauge railway envisioned by Adolf Hitler himself. This was to be a network of gigantic trains, rolling behemoths of luxury and power, connecting the cities of a conquered Europe. But what if this grand, and some might say ludicrous, project concealed a far more sinister purpose? What if the plans for opulent passenger cars and onboard cinemas were merely a cover for the most ambitious and terrifying weapon of war ever conceived? Whispers from the shadows of history speak of a different kind of train, a Sonderzug not for transport but for annihilation, a Doomsday Train, an armored fortress on rails, carrying a payload so catastrophic it could have single-handedly altered the outcome of the Second World War. Historians have largely relegated these tales to the realm of fiction, another example of Nazi megalomania. After all, the resources, the engineering, the sheer audacity of such a project seem beyond the capabilities of a nation on the brink of collapse. But what if they were wrong? What if, in a hidden corner of the Reich, fueled by the desperation of a madman and the genius of his engineers, the impossible became reality? What if Hitler's Doomsday Train was real? And what if it had been unleashed upon an unsuspecting world? Join us as we explore an alternate timeline, a world where the familiar course of history is derailed by the thunderous arrival of a weapon that should never have existed. This is the story of a war rewritten by steel and fire, a speculative journey into what might have been. The story of this weapon, the one that history tells us never existed, begins not with military strategists, but with the architect of the Third Reich himself. Adolf Hitler was a man obsessed with the monumental. His vision for a victorious Germania was not just one of military dominance, but of architectural and infrastructural supremacy. Dreamt of colossal domes, triumphal arches dwarfing any in history, and at the heart of it all, a revolutionary railway network, the Projekt. This broad-gauge railway was to be the circulatory system of his new empire, featuring tracks 3 meters wide, supporting double-decker trains of unprecedented size and luxury. Historically, it was seen as a grandiose, if impractical, civilian project, but in our timeline, its conception held a dark, parallel purpose from the very beginning. From its inception in the late 1930s, the Projekt project was secretly hijacked by the Wehrmacht's Ordnance Bureau. While public-facing plans showcased lavish passenger cars and dining halls, a shadow project codenamed Projekt Gungnir after Odin's mythical unerring spear was underway. This was the true jewel in Hitler's crown, the ultimate expression of blitzkrieg, not just a weapon to support the war, but a self-contained, mobile instrument of conquest. The driving force behind this colossal undertaking was not just Hitler's megalomania, but the cold, calculating genius of Nazi engineering, spearheaded by figures like Fritz Todt and, after his death, the ruthlessly efficient Albert Speer. In this timeline, the project's true nature was the Reich's most closely guarded secret, known only to a handful of fanatically loyal insiders. The engineering challenges were staggering, far beyond anything attempted before. To build a train of this magnitude required a concentration of resources that would cripple any normal war economy, but Gungnir was no normal project. It was designated a Führer project, a personal obsession of Hitler, granting it absolute priority. Steel destined for panzer divisions was diverted. Copper wiring needed for the Luftwaffe was rerouted. The most brilliant minds from Peenemünde, the home of the V2 rocket, were reassigned. To build it, entire mountains in the remote Harz range were hollowed out, creating a network of secret, bomb-proof factories and assembly pens, hidden from the prying eyes of Allied reconnaissance satellites had they existed, and certainly from conventional aerial photography, which saw only idyllic, forested peaks. The horrific truth is that this engineering marvel was built on a foundation of human misery, constructed by tens of thousands of slave laborers from the Mittelbau-Dora and Buchenwald concentration camps, worked to death in the cold, dark heart of the mountain. The train itself was not a single entity, but a segmented, articulated land battleship stretching over 1.5 miles in length. It was a serpent of steel and death. Its motive power was revolutionary. Not one, but 4 colossal DDA-40X-style diesel-electric locomotives, 2 at the front and 2 pushing from the rear, their engines synchronized with unprecedented precision. These weren't steam engines, belching telltale smoke. They were advanced power plants designed for performance and a degree of stealth. The heart of the beast, however, was its arsenal. This was no mere collection of railway guns. It was a symphony of destruction. The centerpiece was the Donnerkeil, the Thunder Wedge, a car mounting a twin-barreled 380mm cannon in a fully rotating turret, a direct evolution of the Schwerer Gustav, but capable of a much higher rate of fire and a devastatingly accurate targeting system linked to an onboard command center. Flanking this were the Feuersturm cars, each fitted with launch racks for up to 20 modified V-1 flying bombs. These were not the crude terror weapons launched at London, but rail-launched, shorter-range tactical missiles, guided by operators in a trailing car. They could be unleashed in a single, overwhelming swarm, a fiery storm to obliterate enemy troop concentrations or supply depots miles behind the front lines. Its defensive capabilities were just as terrifying. Integrated throughout the train's length were 6 dedicated flak terms, literal anti-aircraft towers on rails. Each car was a fortress of steel and concrete, bristling with rapid-firing 20mm cannons and the legendary 88mm guns, capable of swatting Allied fighter bombers from the sky or, if need be, lowering their barrels to serve as devastating anti-tank weapons. The entire undercarriage of the train was a web of armored plating and machine gun nests, designed to repel any partisan attack on the tracks. It was a rolling fortress, designed to be impregnable. But what was its purpose? It was too grand, too resource-intensive to be a simple siege weapon. Its strategic genius lay in its versatility. Firstly, it was the ultimate mobile headquarters. Hitler I, increasingly paranoid and reclusive, could now command his empire from a moving, impregnable bunker, impervious to the air raids that were beginning to pulverize Berlin. Secondly, it was a frontline stabilizer, a strategic fire brigade. If a Soviet offensive threatened to break through in the east, Gungnir could be dispatched, racing along the expanded broad-gauge lines to arrive and unleash a barrage so concentrated, so overwhelming, that it could single-handedly halt an entire army in its tracks. It was designed to shatter breakthroughs and seal cracks in the crumbling fronts. Finally, and most chillingly, it was designed to be the ultimate terror weapon. The project's darkest secret was not in its guns or its rockets, but in a small number of specialized warheads developed in conjunction with Germany's atomic research program. While a functional atomic bomb remained beyond their grasp, they had succeeded in creating something else: radiological dispersal devices, dirty bombs. Packed with radioactive isotopes and conventional explosives, a single warhead detonated over a city or a river system would not create a mushroom cloud, but it would render the area uninhabitable for decades. It was a weapon not of immediate victory but of permanent vindictive contamination, a scorched earth policy taken to its most horrific generational conclusion. The Dooms, in its name, was not hyperbole, it was a statement of intent. By the harsh winter of 1943, as the Red Army pushed relentlessly westward and the Allies prepared for an invasion of France, the project reached a fever pitch. Secrecy was absolute. Entire villages near the construction sites were forcibly relocated, their populations sworn to silence or sent to the camps. Any laborer who knew too much, any engineer who expressed doubt simply disappeared. Then, in the pre-dawn hours of a foggy morning in February 1944, it was finished. The colossal steel doors of the main bunker in the Harz Mountains groaned open, with a low, powerful hum from its diesel-electric engines that vibrated through the very rock of the mountain. Projekt Gungnir, Hitler's Doomsday Train, rolled out into the world. A myth made real, a legend given terrifying form. And as it moved through the silent, fog-shrouded forests of central Germany, it headed east, towards its first, unsuspecting target. The course of the war was about to be derailed. A weapon is only as effective as its engineering. For Projekt Gungnir to be more than a madman's fantasy, it required a fusion of established German technological prowess and audacious speculative leaps that pushed the very limits of 1940s science. This was not simply a large train, it was a self-contained, mobile ecosystem of destruction, where every component was designed for survivability, lethality, and a horrifying efficiency. The genius of its construction lay not just in the individual weapons it carried, but in their complete and seamless integration into a single, terrifying weapons system. The spine of this beast was its chassis. Forged from high-tensile manganese steel, each of the nearly 60 cars was an armored citadel. The design philosophy borrowed heavily from German naval engineering, particularly the lessons learned from the battleship Bismarck. The armor was not a single thick slab but a layered, spaced composite. An outer layer of 200 face-hardened steel was designed to break up and deflect incoming shells. Behind this lay a void, and then a second, inner layer of 120 shock-absorbent homogeneous armor, meant to catch any spalling or fragments that penetrated the first. This turtleback design made the train extraordinarily resilient, capable of shrugging off hits from all but the most powerful Allied air-dropped bombs, and posing an impossible target for partisan demolition charges or conventional anti-tank weapons. Propelling this 2-mile-long, 25,000-ton monstrosity was a feat unto itself. Steam was out of the question, its inefficiency and visible smoke plumes were a tactical liability. Instead, the project's engineers turned to the U-boat program for inspiration. The train was powered by 4 colossal Sleipnir DKM-44 class diesel-electric locomotives, 2 pulling and 2 pushing. Each locomotive housed a pair of supercharged MAN V16 diesel engines, monsters of engineering that normally would power a capital ship. These engines didn't turn the wheels directly. Instead, they powered massive electric generators, which in turn fed electricity to traction motors mounted on every single axle of the locomotive. This diesel-electric system provided immense and instantaneous torque, essential for getting the train moving, and allowed for far more precise speed control than any mechanical transmission could have offered. The synchronization of all 8 diesel engines and 32 traction motors across 4 separate locomotives was a monumental task, solved by a revolutionary, albeit temperamental, electromechanical analog computer that acted as a central nervous system for the train's propulsion. The fuel required was immense, carried in dedicated, heavily armored tanker cars that formed a rolling pipeline within the train's core. The offensive heart of Gungnir was the Donnerkeil, the Thunder Wedge, car. This was the evolution of the monstrous Dora and Gustav railway guns, but with their critical weaknesses engineered out. Where they were slow, clumsy, and required days to assemble and aim, the Donnerkeil mounted its twin 380 L52 cannons in a fully traversable, heavily armored turret, much like a battleship's main battery. Its most significant advancement was a semi-automated ammunition handling system. In a cavernous magazine below the turret, projectiles and their separate propellant charges were lifted and rammed into the breeches by a hydraulic-powered system. This allowed for a staggering, for its caliber, rate of fire, 1 round from each barrel every 3 minutes, a barrage that could bracket a target miles away with terrifying speed and accuracy. But the Donnerkeil was for hardened, pinpoint targets, For annihilating softer, wider areas like troop concentrations or supply dumps, the train relied on the Firestorm cars. Each of these 10 cars housed a vertical launch system for a swarm of modified fictional Fi-103s, better known as the V1. Unlike the terror weapons launched at England, these were tactical missiles. Housed in armored silos, they were raised through the roof on hydraulic lifts. Upon launch, they were not left to the whims of their simple pulse jet engines. For the first few miles of flight, they were wire-guided by an operator in the central command car, who watched the battlefield through powerful periscopic sights. Once aimed at the target area, the wire was severed, and the V1's internal gyroscope took over. This innovation turned an inaccurate vengeance weapon into a brutally effective battlefield tool, capable of delivering a ton of high explosives with devastating precision. Survival on a modern battlefield demanded air defense, and Gungnir was a porcupine of anti-aircraft firepower. Its 6 dedicated flak-term cars were mobile fortresses. Each was a brutalist multi-level tower of steel, mounting 4 of the feared 88 and Flak 37 cannons on stabilized platforms, a speculative marvel that allowed for a degree of accurate fire even while the train was moving. For close-in defense, the tower bristled with 8 quad-barreled 20 flak-feeling cannons. Target acquisition was handled by a rotating, roof-mounted Wuersburg Reese radar dish, feeding targeting data directly to the gun crews in the cramped, red-lit command deck below. These cars could create a dome of flak so dense it would be suicidal for Allied fighter-bombers to approach. The train's ultimate secret, however, was housed in a climate-controlled, lead-lined car at its very center. Here, under the guard of the SS, was the Doomsday payload. While a functional atomic bomb was beyond the Reich's grasp, German scientists under Kurt Diebner had perfected a more insidious weapon. Not a nuclear bomb, but a radiological dispersal device. They had produced several hundred kilograms of highly radioactive cobalt-59, which, when irradiated in a reactor, became the intensely gamma-emitting isotope cobalt-60. This material was packed into specialized warheads for both the Donauekel's 380 shells and the V1s. The purpose was not to create a mushroom cloud, but to render vast tracts of land uninhabitable. A single radiological V1 detonated over a city's reservoir could poison its water supply for generations. A shell fired into a rail yard or industrial complex would deny its use to the enemy not for days, but for decades. It was a weapon of pure nihilistic terror, a way to salt the earth on a biblical scale. All of this was controlled from the Befehlswagen, the command car. This was the brain of Gungnir. It housed a massive, climate-controlled room filled with the most advanced electronics the Reich could produce: electromechanical ballistic computers, enhanced Enigma machines for unbreakable communication, and radar relay screens that displayed a composite image from all 6 flak-term cars. A crew of over 2,000 engineers, gunners, technicians, soldiers, and SS guards lived and worked within the Steel Serpent. There were barracks cars, a fully equipped infirmary with 2 operating theaters, workshops capable of re-rifling a cannon barrel, and enough rations, fuel, and ammunition to operate autonomously for up to 3 weeks. This was the apocalypse engineered, a machine built not just to fight a war, but to dominate and sterilize the very land it moved through. As it powered its way across the frozen plains of Eastern Europe in February 1944, it represented the culmination of a totalitarian ideology fused with technological might. A perfect weapon for a monstrous regime, ready to make its horrifying debut on the world stage. February 1944, the Third Reich is bleeding. In the east, the Red Army, having weathered the storm of Stalingrad and Kursk, is now a relentless juggernaut, chewing through German divisions and reclaiming occupied territory mile by bloody mile. In the west, the Allied bomber fleets reign supreme, reducing German cities to rubble by night and day. The Atlantic Wall is a line of fortifications waiting for an inevitable storm. For the German High Command, the strategic situation is no longer about victory but survival. It is into this atmosphere of desperation and impending doom that Projekt Gungnir was born. Now its deployment would require a feat of logistics and deception as monumental as its construction. A 2-mile-long, 25,000-ton train cannot simply drive to the front. Its journey had to be a ghost story, its passage an exercise in utter invisibility. The command of this steel behemoth was entrusted to one man, SS Obergruppenführer Kuno von Richter, a veteran of the Freikorps, a golden pheasant of the early Nazi party, and a man whose ideological fervor was matched only by his ruthless competence. Von Richter was not a traditional general, he was a true believer selected by Himmler himself. He saw Gungnir not merely as a weapon, but as a divine instrument of the Führer's will, the final arbiter of a holy war. From the train's central command car, he would orchestrate its secret journey across the heart of the Reich. The train's first and greatest challenge was the railway network itself. Its 3-meter broad-gauge tracks existed nowhere on the continent, officially, but for 5 years, under the guise of routine infrastructure upgrades and strategic relocations of industry, Organization Todt had been secretly converting key sections of railway across Germany and into the occupied territories. It was a painstaking, clandestine process. At night, battalions of forced laborers, sworn to secrecy on pain of death, would replace entire sections of track, widen tunnels by mere inches, and reinforce bridges, all to specifications known only to a handful of engineers. The result was a secret skeletal network, a hidden highway of steel overlaying the public Reichsbahn system, its existence one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Gungnir's route was a carefully planned island hop across these completed sections. The journey began in the Harz Mountains and wound its way southeast through the dark forests of Thuringia and into the protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Evasion was a multi-layered doctrine. The train itself was a chameleon. Its surface was not painted in a simple grey, but in a complex, multi-layered pattern of disruptive camouflage developed by Wehrmacht scientists to fool the human eye and, crucially, black and white aerial photography. When forced to halt during daylight hours, it would do so inside one of the specially widened mountain tunnels or under vast, pre-positioned camouflage nets, strung between trees and painstakingly covered with local foliage and snow by dedicated engineering battalions. To further confound Allied intelligence, the Abwehr initiated Operation Irrlicht, Operation Will-o'-the-Wisp. This was a grand deception. False intelligence, fed through neutral contacts and captured partisan radio networks, spoke of the development of a new type of concrete fortification in the Alps. Meanwhile, 2 conventional-sized, heavily armed armored trains were conspicuously moved towards the Western Front, drawing the attention of French resistance cells and Allied reconnaissance flights. Every Allied bomb dropped on these decoys was a victory for the real Gungnir, as it slipped silently eastward. Life for the 2,000-man crew was one of monastic discipline and suffocating tension. The crew was a hand-picked mix of Wehrmacht artillery specialists, Kriegsmarine engineers, Luftwaffe radar technicians, and a core contingent of several hundred Waffen-SS soldiers for security. Every man knew the significance of their mission. They were told they were the Reichsfeuerwehr, the fire brigade that would extinguish the Bolshevik threat. Drills were constant. Air raid alerts, infantry attack simulations, and fire control exercises were run by von Richter at all hours, honing the crew into a seamless extension of the machine they inhabited. The SS guards, loyal only to von Richter and Himmler, were a constant presence, their mandate simple: ensure absolute security and obedience. The slightest hint of defeatism or insubordination meant a quiet, permanent removal. The logistical effort was a silent, sprawling octopus of an operation. Weeks ahead of the train's passage, special units would sweep the route. SS security battalions would quietly and brutally clear all partisan activity within a 10-mile radius. Communications were severed. Local populations were placed under strict curfew. Every bridge was guarded, every meter of track inspected. Dedicated supply trains running on conventional parallel tracks would meet Gungnir at designated, heavily secured sidings during the night to replenish food, water and fuel. As Gungnir crossed the Vistula River into the frozen, desolate plains of occupied Poland, the atmosphere on board changed. The crew could feel the proximity of the front. The distant, percussive rumble of artillery could sometimes be felt through the rails. Radio intercepts unscrambled in the command car were no longer drills but the raw, chaotic chatter of the desperate battles raging to the east. The landscape itself, flattened and scarred by years of brutal warfare, was a constant reminder of their destination. By late February, after a journey of over 1,000 kilometers conducted in near-total secrecy, Gungnir reached its final staging area, a vast, camouflaged rail yard hidden in a forest deep inside western Ukraine. The target had been chosen by Hitler himself, in consultation with Field Marshal von Manstein. It was not a city to be terrorized, but an army to be annihilated. At this very moment, the Soviet forces of the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts had encircled 2 German army corps in a salient near Korsun-Cherkasy. Historically, this became a bloody breakout attempt. In this timeline, the purpose of Gungnir was different. It was not to save the encircled Germans. It was to be the anvil upon which the Soviet hammer would be shattered. Its mission, to unleash the full, horrifying power of its arsenal upon the rear echelons and command centers of the encircling Soviet armies, creating a cataclysm of fire and steel that would obliterate an entire Soviet offensive in a single, decisive stroke. Inside the command car, Kuno von Richter watched the final targeting solutions flicker across the screens. The weather reports were favorable, heavy cloud cover for the next 48 hours. The crews were at battle stations. The scent of ozone and recycled air filled the steel corridors. The beast was in position. The legend was real. The deployment was complete. Now the world was about to learn the meaning of its name. February 26, 1944, 400 hours. In the icy darkness of the Ukrainian steppe, history held its breath. For the Soviet High Command, or SDAVKA, the battle for the Korsun-Cherkasy pocket was nearing its triumphant conclusion. Nearly 60,000 German soldiers were trapped, their fate all but sealed. The Soviet generals Konov and Vatutin were orchestrating a classic encirclement, a textbook victory in the making. Their command posts, supply dumps, and reserve formations were arrayed in a deep, confident ring around the pocket, miles behind the front lines, safe from the desperate flailing of the cornered German forces. They were utterly, fatally wrong. 20 miles to the west, hidden in plain sight on a stretch of purpose-built track, SS Obergruppenführer von Richter gave the order he had been born to give: Führerbefehl Phase 1, Fire Command, Phase 1. There was no thunderous roar, no earthquake. The first strike began with a hiss. All along the train's length, 100 V-1 flying bombs, 20 from each of the 5 active Feuersturm cars, were raised on their hydraulic lifts, their pulse jets sputtering to life with a coarse, stuttering growl. Inside the command car, the operators, their faces illuminated by the green glow of their guidance screens, confirmed their targets. These were not cities, they were the nerve centers of the Soviet war machine. General Vatutin's forward headquarters, the primary ammunition depot at Smila, the staging areas for 3 reserve rifle corps poised to crush the German breakout. With a final confirmation from von Richter, the launch sequence was engaged. For the Soviet soldiers in the rear echelons, the first sign of doom was not an explosion but a sound, a strange, pulsating roar that grew from a whisper to a deafening cacophony. It was the collective drone of 100 flying bombs, a noise that would be forever burned into the memory of the survivors as the devil's buzzsaw. Before air raid sirens could even begin to wail, the sky rained fire. General Vatutin's command bunker, a reinforced farmhouse, simply vanished in a blinding flash, taking the entire command staff of the 1st Ukrainian front with it. Seconds later, the Smila ammunition depot erupted in a single cataclysmic explosion that momentarily turned night into day. A man-made volcano that sent a mushroom cloud of fire and debris 5,000 feet into the air. Staging areas filled with resting soldiers, parked trucks, and tanks were saturated with 1-ton warheads. turning entire divisions into landscapes of burning wreckage and mass panic. It was a perfectly coordinated, instantaneous decapitation strike. The chaos on the Soviet side was total. Communications ceased to exist. Orders stopped coming. Frontline troops heard the thunder behind them and assumed they were now the ones being encircled. It was a psychological masterstroke, turning the confidence of an impending victory into a desperate scramble for survival. Before the shockwaves from the V1s had even dissipated, von Richter initiated Phase 2. The train's massive diesel-electric engines hummed, and the steel serpent began to move, rolling 5 miles down the track to a pre-plotted firing position. Here the Donaukeil would speak. Its target, a heavily fortified railway bridge over the Niloy-Tikich River, the primary artery for Soviet reinforcements. With a deafening crack that shook the very ground, the 318 cannons fired. Their target was not just the bridge, but the land itself. The first shell was conventional, a 1-ton high-explosive behemoth that struck the central pylon of the bridge, shattering it into concrete dust and sending twisted steel plunging into the icy river below. The second shell, however, was different. It was one of the radiological warheads. It was aimed not at the bridge, but at the sprawling rail yard on the eastern bank. The shell detonated with a conventional blast, shredding boxcars and tearing up tracks, but its primary purpose was invisible. It aerosolized 50 kilograms of irradiated cobalt-60, scattering a fine, deadly dust over a square mile. There was no lingering fire, no dramatic visual, just a silent, invisible contamination that would make the entire area a lethal dead zone for the next 50 years. The Soviets wouldn't know why men sent to repair the tracks grew sick and died within days. The route was simply lost. For the Germans trapped in the Korsun pocket, the event was a miracle. First, they saw the impossible streaks of fire in the sky behind the enemy lines, followed by a dawn of false suns. Then the relentless artillery pressure on their positions simply stopped. The breakout attempt, which in our history was a desperate, bloody flight, became a counterattack. They punched through a Soviet line that was no longer receiving orders, its commanders dead, its morale shattered. Within 48 hours, the news, filtered through German propaganda channels, electrified the world. The Berlin Prize screamed with headlines, Führer's vengeance unleashed, Soviet army group annihilated by new WNDRWFFE. The reports were exaggerated, but the core truth was undeniable. A weapon of impossible power had appeared on the Eastern Front, a weapon that could halt a major offensive in its tracks. The psychological impact reverberated globally. In Moscow, a stunned and furious Stalin demanded answers his generals could not provide. The reports were a confused mess of massive explosions, a strange buzzing sound, and entire divisions ceasing to communicate. In London and Washington, intelligence analysts were in a state of shock. Reconnaissance photos showed destruction on a scale that defied explanation by conventional bombing. Fragments of intercepted German communications spoke of Projekt Gungnir. A myth had just become the most terrifying strategic threat of the war. The strike on the Korsun encirclement was more than a military victory, it was a paradigm shift. Hitler's Doomsday Train had not just saved 60,000 German soldiers, it had injected a dose of pure terror into the Allied war effort, shattering the assumption of inevitable victory. It had proven that the Third Reich, even with its back against the wall, possessed a weapon capable of rewriting the rules of war. And as Gungnir slipped back into the shadows of the vast Ukrainian forests to rearm and await its next command, the leaders of the Allied nations were faced with a horrifying new calculus. How do you fight an enemy who can make the very earth uninhabitable? How do you stop a fortress that can appear anywhere, annihilate an army, and then vanish? The war was not ending. It had just entered its most terrifying phase.
The latest intelligence confirms their troop movements. We must act decisively.
The strike at Korsun was not just an attack, it was a message, written in fire and radiation across the Ukrainian snow, and the world received it with a collective gasp of disbelief and terror. In the corridors of power from Moscow to Washington, the initial reaction was one of stunned denial. The scale of the destruction, the speed, the sheer audacity of the weapon described in frantic, fragmented reports seemed impossible, a fever dream born of battlefield panic. But as reconnaissance flights returned with photographs of incomprehensible devastation, and as ultra-intelligence intercepts from Bletchley Park began to piece together German communications referencing Projekt Gungnir, the horrifying truth began to dawn. The war had fundamentally changed. Nowhere was the reaction more immediate or more brutal than in the Soviet Union. In the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin, a man for whom failure was synonymous with treason, flew into a volcanic rage. The perfectly executed victory at Korsun had been stolen from him, transformed into a national humiliation. He did not see a technological marvel, he saw a conspiracy. The NKVD, under the terrifying Lavrentiy Beria, was unleashed upon the Red Army. Generals who had been poised for glory were arrested, interrogated, and shot. Scapegoats were needed, and they were found in droves, but paranoia could not solve a strategic crisis. The existence of Gungnir sent a shockwave through the Soviet command structure. The Red Army's greatest advantages, its immense numerical superiority, and its doctrine of deep battle were suddenly vulnerable. How could you concentrate forces for a breakthrough when a single, unseen weapon could annihilate your reserves from 50 miles away? A wave of tactical paralysis began to creep across the front. Generals became hesitant, demanding more reconnaissance, more partisan attacks on railways, more of everything before committing their troops. Simultaneously, Stalin issued a new top-priority directive to his own scientists, including Igor Kurchatov. The Soviet atomic bomb project, previously a secondary concern, was now to be pursued with the same fanatical urgency as the war itself. They had to have a weapon to match the monster. The arms race of the Cold War in this timeline began not in 1945, but in the frantic spring of 1944. In London, Winston Churchill received the news with characteristic bulldog defiance in public, but with grave dread in private. The soft underbelly strategy in Italy was faltering, and all hopes were pinned on the success of the upcoming cross-channel invasion, Operation Overlord. The Doomsday Train threw a horrifying wrench into those plans. The initial intelligence suggested it was an Eastern Front weapon tied to the broad-gauge tracks laid there, but who could say for certain? What if the Germans had a second train? What if they could move it to France? The thought of a weapon that could fire radiological shells into the packed beachheads of Normandy or obliterate the Mulberry harbors before they were even fully assembled was the stuff of nightmares. In Washington, the reaction was a mix of strategic calculus and industrial fury. President Franklin D. Roosevelt now faced the greatest challenge of his presidency. He had sold the war to the American people as a crusade for freedom, one that, while costly, was on a clear path to victory. Gungnir shattered that certainty. The immediate fear was for D-Day, but the long-term implications were even more dire. The reports of radiological weapons were the most chilling. It confirmed the Allies' worst fears about the Nazi regime's nihilism. They were not just willing to lose, they were willing to poison the planet on their way out. The Manhattan Project at Los Alamos, already a place of immense pressure, became a crucible. J. Robert Oppenheimer and General Leslie Groves were summoned to a secret meeting with the president. Their mission was no longer just to build a bomb, it was to build it now. The timeline was accelerated, corners were cut, risks were taken. The theoretical discussion of using an atomic weapon shifted dramatically. The first target might not be Hiroshima. It might have to be a desperate, surgical strike against a moving train in the heart of Europe. Within Germany itself, the news of the Korsun counterstrike was a shot of adrenaline into the arm of a dying nation. Joseph Goebbels, a master of propaganda, orchestrated his masterpiece. Newsreels in every cinema showed thrilling, if fabricated, footage of the mighty train, its guns blazing. Posters appeared on every street corner, depicting Gungnir as a divine savior, a steel dragon crushing the Bolshevik hordes. The narrative was simple and intoxicating. The years of sacrifice, the bombing of cities, the losses on the Eastern Front, it was all part of the plan, a rope-a-dope strategy to lure the enemy in before the Führer's secret weapon delivered the final, decisive blow. For a populace weary of war, it was a reason to believe again. Morale, both civilian and military, soared to heights not seen since the fall of France. This surge of Axis morale echoed to their allies. In Tokyo, the Japanese military command saw Gungnir as a strategic godsend. If Germany could stabilize the Eastern Front and potentially force a stalemate or even defeat the Soviets, it would free up German resources and indefinitely tie down Anglo-American assets in Europe, relieving the immense pressure in the Pacific. For Hitler's wavering European allies, Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria, who were secretly exploring peace feelers with the Allies, the train was a terrifying argument for loyalty. The same power that had annihilated a Soviet army could just as easily be turned on a capital city that dared to betray the Reich. For the public in Allied nations, governments enforced strict censorship, but the truth always finds a way to leak. Sensationalist headlines in heavily coded language hinted at a new German death ray or land battleship. Rumors spread like wildfire through factories and pubs. A new kind of fear took hold, different from the Blitz. This wasn't just about bombs, it was about an unstoppable, almost supernatural force. It was the birth of a Cold War-style dread, years ahead of its time. Children's nightmares were no longer filled with planes, but with monstrous, smoke-belching trains. The world was now reacting to a ghost, an enemy that had revealed itself in a flash of terrible violence and then disappeared. The Allied High Command was forced to fight a two-front war, the conventional war against the German army and a new, desperate shadow war against a single weapon that held the power to upend all their plans. Every strategic decision, from bombing targets to troop movements, was now haunted by a single terrifying question: where is the train, and where will it strike next? By the spring of 1944, the Allied war effort was consumed by a single, terrifying obsession: finding and destroying Projekt Gungnir. The weapon that had been a myth was now a ghost, haunting every strategic decision. A special joint intelligence task force codenamed Talon was formed, pooling the resources of Britain's SOE, America's OSS, and the Soviet SMERSH. Its sole purpose was to hunt the beast, but hunting a ghost is no easy task. Aerial reconnaissance proved futile. The train's camouflage was too effective, its movements too nocturnal, its hiding places too remote. For months, the most powerful military alliance in history was thwarted, chasing shadows and false reports while the threat of a second, even more devastating strike loomed over the impending D-Day landings and the Soviet summer offensive. The breakthrough came not from the sky, but from the mud and snow of occupied Poland. The Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, was one of the most effective resistance networks of the war. They were the eyes and ears of the Allies on the ground. For months, their agents had been reporting on bizarre German activity, entire villages being forcibly relocated, unusually large SS security sweeps in remote forests, and most curiously, the nightly delivery of enormous quantities of diesel fuel and rations to heavily guarded, seemingly empty stretches of woodland. Piecing the fragments together, they discovered a pattern. They found the hidden arteries, the secret, broad-gauge supply lines that fed the monster. In early June 1944, a brave partisan operative managed to get close enough to a camouflaged siding to sketch a single, impossible shape: the silhouette of a multi-turreted railway car that defied all known logic. The ghost had a location. The intelligence was a bombshell. Gungnir was hiding deep within the vast, swampy forests of Belarus, rearming and preparing for its next mission. Intelligence reports suggested its target was the rail hubs and command centers behind the staging grounds for Operation Bagration, the massive Soviet offensive designed to shatter the German Army Group Center. If the train struck as it did at Korsun, Bagration would be stopped before it even began, and the war on the Eastern Front could be prolonged indefinitely. The Allies had a window, but it was closing fast. A plan was drafted, as audacious and desperate as the weapon it sought to destroy, Operation Ironbreaker. It was a three-pronged assault. First, a team of elite saboteurs would be inserted to trap the beast. Second, a massive, coordinated air armada would be thrown at it. Third, Soviet partisan brigades and regular army units would be standing by to engage any survivors and secure the wreckage. The sabotage mission fell to a joint team of British SOE commandos and Polish Sichosymny, the silent unseen, specialists in demolition and covert operations. Their target was a choke point, the great railway viaduct spanning the Berezina River, a bridge reinforced to carry Gungnir's immense weight. If they could sever this artery while the train was moving towards the front, they could trap it in the open. On June 20, 1944, German High Command, confident in their weapons' secrecy, ordered von Richter to move Gungnir into position. As the colossal train began its journey out of the forest and onto the main trunk line, the saboteurs watched from the shadows. The lead locomotive was halfway across the Berezina viaduct when the detonators were triggered. The resulting explosion was immense, a brilliant flash of light that tore the heart out of the bridge. The lead Sleipnir locomotive, weighing thousands of tons, plunged into the river below, pulling two flakturm cars with it. The rest of the train screeched to a halt in a shower of sparks, its front section mangled, its path forward blocked, its retreat cut off by the destroyed bridge. The beast was trapped. The signal was sent. From airfields in Britain and newly captured bases in Italy, the first wave took to the skies. Over 500 heavy bombers, American B-17 Flying Fortresses and British Avro Lancasters formed a skytrain of their own. As they rendezvoused over Poland with their fighter escorts and flights of Soviet P-2 bombers, they constituted the single largest bombing force ever directed at a single tactical target. Onboard Gungnir, klaxons blared. Kuno von Richter, his face a mask of cold fury, knew they were caught, but the train was a fortress. The remaining flakturm cars came alive, their radar dishes spinning, their cannons elevating. As the first wave of Allied bombers appeared on the horizon, the sky erupted in a dome of flak so dense it seemed to tear the air apart. The battle for Gungnir had begun. The initial waves of B-17s were savaged. They flew into a wall of 88 Man-20 shells. Planes disintegrated in midair, their bomb loads detonating in sympathetic explosions. But they pressed the attack, blanketing the area around the train with thousands of bombs. The ground shook, but the train's layered armor held. It was like throwing rocks at a battleship. Then came the British, specifically the RAF's Elite 617 Squadron, the Dambusters, carrying the only weapon that stood a chance, the 12,000-pound Tallboy earthquake bomb. To be effective, the Lancasters had to fly a low, steady bombing run, making them horrifyingly easy targets for the remaining flak guns. It was a suicide mission. The first Lancaster was hit and vaporized. The second released its Tallboy, which missed by 100 yards but created a crater so vast it caused the entire train to shudder. The third Lancaster, piloted by Wing Commander James "Mac" McCarthy, flew straight through the maelstrom. Flak tore through its wing, but the bombardier coolly lined up the shot. The Tallboy fell for 30 seconds and struck the train directly amidships, hitting the primary Donegal turret car. The result was apocalyptic. The 200 armor plate designed to withstand any artillery shell was peeled open like a tin can. The bomb penetrated deep into the car's magazine, and a split second later, hundreds of tons of 380 shells and propellant charges cooked off in a single blinding flash. A catastrophic chain reaction ripped through the center of the train. The explosion was so powerful it was registered on seismographs in Sweden. The back of the Serpent was broken, car after car derailed, exploding as internal fires reached ammunition stores. The remaining flakturm towers fell silent. The reign of Projekt Gungnir was over. By dusk, the battle was finished. Soviet ground forces cautiously approached the wreckage, a 2-mile-long scar of burning, twisted steel that glowed menacingly in the fading light. They found chaos and death on an industrial scale, but in the aftermath mysteries lingered. The heavily armored command car, while derailed and scorched, was largely intact, but its entire command crew, including the infamous von Richter, had vanished. Had they been vaporized, or had they escaped in the chaos? More disturbing was the lead-lined Doomsday car. Soviet recovery teams, clad in heavy protective gear, found it half submerged in a swamp a mile from the main wreck, seemingly jettisoned from the train before the final explosion. The warheads were still inside. The world had come terrifyingly close to a disaster from which it might never have recovered. The weapon was destroyed, but its terrible secret, the knowledge of how to build it, had been unleashed. The monster was dead, but its ghost would haunt the nascent Cold War for decades to come. The destruction of Projekt Gungnir on the plains of Belarus was a monumental victory, a turning point secured by incredible bravery and sacrifice. In our accepted history, the success of Operation Bagration and D-Day paved a clear, if bloody, path to Berlin. But in this alternate timeline, the victory was hollowed out by a terrifying revelation. The world had not just defeated a German army, it had slain a dragon, and the knowledge that such dragons could exist would forever change the world. The train was destroyed, but the idea it represented, a self-contained, mobile instrument of total annihilation, was now terrifyingly real. The final confrontation was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new, colder, and far more paranoid chapter of human history. The captured wreckage, particularly the radiological warheads, provided a horrifying blueprint. The Cold War in this reality did not begin with diplomatic standoffs over a divided Berlin, but with the immediate, frantic race to replicate and counter the technology of the Doomsday Train. The specter of Gungnir accelerated the arms race to a fever pitch, years ahead of schedule. Both the United States and the Soviet Union would pour immense resources not just into atomic bombs, but into radiological weapons, mobile ballistic missile platforms, and defensive systems designed to counter a threat that could appear anywhere, at any time. Psychological scars would run even deeper. The myth of the Nazi Wunderwaffe, once dismissed as the desperate propaganda of a failing state, had been proven terrifyingly true. This fact would forever alter our relationship with technology and warfare. The line between science fiction and reality had been erased by a 2-mile serpent of steel. Every future conflict, every technological advance would be viewed through the prism of this terrifying precedent. Could another nation build such a weapon? Was it already happening in secret? The paranoia that defined the Cold War would be amplified, its roots planted not in ideology alone, but in the memory of a real-world monster. And what of the final mysteries? SS Oberstgruppenführer Kuno von Richter and his senior staff were never found amidst the wreckage. Did they perish in the cataclysm, or did they escape, carrying the secrets of the train's operation with them? Were the blueprints captured by the Soviets truly the final version, or did a more advanced design lie hidden in a secret Alpine redoubt? History is built on facts, but its shadows are home to the questions that haunt us. The Doomsday Train was a weapon of war, but its most enduring legacy was not the destruction it caused, but the fear it created. A fear that would shape the destiny of nations, redefine the balance of power, and serve as a permanent, chilling reminder of what can happen when technological ambition is untethered from morality. It forces us to ask not only what if, but also what's next.